Hey YouTubers, welcome back to John's Garage. Once again today we're working on the 2000 Acura 3.2 TL, and today we're going to work on a little bit of an oil leak. And when you're chasing down an oil leak, you want to start high up in the engine. Even though you see oil dripping down, maybe like off the oil pan onto the ground, it's probably not coming from the oil pan. It's probably coming from somewhere higher, like valve cover gaskets. In this car we did the valve cover gaskets and still have a little bit of a leak. Not really enough to hit the driveway, but enough to make a little bit of a mess on the side. So we've got some oil down here by the EGR, and originally thought maybe the valve cover gaskets, those were changed. Still a little bit of oil after cleaning it off, it came back. So what we're going to change is the camshaft cover O-rings. So it's little O-rings, look like this. It's a Honda part number 91301-P8A-A00. It's an O-ring. The book calls it O-ring cylinder head. It's really for the camshaft covers. And there's two of them. So we've got two O-rings here, and we're going to change front bank, rear bank. Yeah, they've never been changed on this car. 20 years, 600,000 miles. I think they're leaking, so I'm going to go ahead and change them. These things are $2 each at the dealer. So first thing we got to do, get all the plastic beauty covers off. So let's do that now. Okay, so the front plastic cover, top plastic cover are both off. Now we need to get a little more around the EGR off, and even the EGR will take that off. Okay, so the EGR comes off with a 12mm box wrench. Just two nuts there. Take those off and unplug the electrical connector for the EGR and just lift that out of there. There should be a little gasket on there. Okay, so this is what we're after. This cover here, there's an O-ring inside that, so two bolts on there. Let's see what size those are. 12mm. So let's get those taken off of there. Okay, using our 12mm box wrench, we got those two bolts out. Pretty long bolts. So we'll set those aside. Okay, now that we've gotten the bolts out, I hit it with some degreaser, get some of that off because I don't want any dirt getting inside my engine head. So now we just got to move this a little bit. So I'm going to take a screwdriver and just give a little tap with a rubber mallet, get it to move a little bit, back and forth, get that loose. Start working its way out. Once you got it angled, you could start prying on it a little bit. Get it to pry out of there. You don't want to bend it or deform it. Okay, with a screwdriver at the bottom and a screwdriver at the top, just a little wiggling and prying on the ears. Get that to come out of there. There, got it. There we go. Ooh, a little bit of oil. So that's what it looks like. We are very careful not to damage any of the mating surfaces on there. So here's a close-up of that O-ring. That's what we're changing today. Okay, so using a little pick tool, we're going to get that O-ring out of there, and it is pretty dry and hard, not very flexible anymore. There we go. Yeah, that's almost like hard plastic now. It's no longer very flexible at all. Doesn't really bend. Okay, so we put the new O-ring in there and take a finger of motor oil and get that oiled up so it doesn't bind when you're sticking it back in. Okay, so we got our cover all shined up, all degreased. And look inside there, make sure no contamination got in there. So that is your camshaft. Okay, so we got the cover lined up and we put the bolts in part way. So we're just going to thread the bolts in and it's going to pull that oil seal in tight there. Just go back and forth between the two bolts, one turn at a time, so you get that thing seated evenly. Okay, let's make sure the two bolts are torqued evenly. I don't know what the torque spec is, but it's not very high. Maybe, I'm guessing 25 foot-pounds at the most. The Civics, Honda Civics, these covers are just plastic, so this car they used aluminum with two bolts, so it doesn't need a lot of torque. It's just to keep that cover in place. The O-ring does the sealing to make sure the oil doesn't leak out. So the front cover is done. So here's how it looks all cleaned up and installed. So now we just need to put the EGR back in place and connect a couple of air lines. Okay, so we got the two bolts back on the EGR. The gasket is in there. We connected this air line here, put our connector back on our EGR, and that front is done. I think I'm going to put a little tape around these wires so that they don't get damaged. Okay, so switching to the rear bank, a little more complicated because we've got the fuel pressure regulator in the way, and that is the device with the white plastic cap there. So down at the bottom where the light is shining, there are two nuts I'm going to take off. See if we can move that out of the way an inch or so, because the camshaft cover is right behind that. Okay, so used a piece of rope and tied the fuel line out of the way. It only pulls back about 2 inches, but it gives me enough room to work. So what we have here now is the rear cam cover, and you can see there's a bolt here and a bolt down here. Kind of hard to show you, but there's a bolt and there's a bolt. So 1, 2, just like the front cover, except it's got this bracket for the fuel pressure regulator. So the process is the same. Hopefully we can get this bottom bolt out with this water hose here. I really don't want to have to disconnect it, but hopefully we could push it out of the way enough to pull that bolt out. I think we can. So let's undo those two bolts, 12mm box. Okay, for the bottom bolt, I could barely get the box wrench on there and move it, so I had to use a socket wrench. Just squish the hose down a little, get the socket on with a 6-inch extension and a little bit of a leverage bar on it to break it loose. That thing was really on there tight from the factory. Okay, I hit it with some degreaser so that I don't get any dirt inside when I open it. Use a toothbrush to clean it all off. Pulled out the two bolts, and this one it's not quite as tight of a fit. So I'm able to wiggle it out by hand without prying it with a screwdriver. There we go. And it's off. So it looks just like the front one. Camshaft inside. Okay, so once again, put lots of oil on here. That's the new O-ring. And inside the camshaft cover, take your finger, put lots of oil because you want this to slip in there with no binding whatsoever. It is a machine fit, and you got a rubber O-ring. You don't want to damage the metal or the O-ring. So lots of oil. In case you're wondering, the logo on this is the upside, so that's the upside. Okay, so after test fitting it, it turns out that logo is not the top. That letter D, right there, that letter D is the top. The logo is the bottom, because these two holes won't line up the other way around. It only fits one way, so the letter D is the top here, and that logo, that is the bottom. Okay, so that cover snapped in place there. I'll give you a little higher angle there. Wiggle a little bit. It's not as tight of a machine fit as the front one, but wiggle clockwise, counterclockwise a little bit. You've got oil in there, so just wiggle, wiggle, wiggle until it snaps into place, and then line up the holes and carefully hand thread those bolts in. Okay, I looked up the torque spec of these two bolts, and it is 16 foot-pounds. And this cover is officially called a camshaft thrust cover, and we replaced the O-ring on it to keep the oil from leaking out. So now we put our two 10mm bolts to hold the fuel pressure regulator. Two 10mm. We connect this little air hose here, and then we'll put on our top plastic cover, 4 10mm bolts, our front cover, quarter turn on the plastic screws, and we're done. Okay, right before I put the covers on, I started up the engine to look for leaks in those two thrust covers, camshaft thrust covers. There's no leaks, no oil leaks, so we're good. I put the cover back on, and we can call this job done.